Hi, and welcome back to our series on the structure of behavior by Merleau-Ponty. Today we're going to start part 2 of our series, which is also coinciding with part 2 of the book. So here I have the table of contents. Again, I'm using the 1963 edition, English translation. So that's what these page numbers correspond to. Today we're beginning part 2. Next time we'll do the second half of part 2, which is titled Higher Forms of Behavior, starting on page 52. So just a reminder, if you haven't seen part 1 yet that I've done on this book, go and watch that first. It gives you really important background, lays the foundation of the part 1 of the book. Just a reminder, though, that the main overarching question of this book is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature, organic, psychological, or even social. By nature, we understand here a multiplicity of events external to each other and bound together by relations of causality. And again, he is exploring these different schools of thought, focusing on like idealism versus kind of a realism of things as things versus ideas. I don't know if I described it like this as much in my first video, but it's the idea that there can be these camps where they want to focus on one or the other. But also what Merleau-Ponty is ultimately kind of critical of is the fact that each of those extremes kind of necessitates the existence of the other. So it's not only that they are opposed to each other, it's almost just kind of this opposition, this separation of idea and thing that kind of requires the other end to be extreme, and they kind of feed into each other. So it's not just that some people think that there are things and some people that think there are just like pure idea. It's that when you take one of those views, it kind of necessarily feeds into the existence of the other as two opposite things. And what he's really trying to do is find a synthesis of consciousness and nature in this book. So I don't know if I explained that much in the first video, but I think it's an important point. Okay, so in part 2, he starts to critique Pavlov's reflexology. This video is a bit hard for me to make because there is a lot of dry kind of material in this part of the book. I really do not go into it all in this video. I'm going to give you a rough idea of what these pages contain. And it's for folks to go and read it for themselves if you want to really know the nitty-gritty of his critiques of Pavlov. But I'll do my best to kind of give you some of the important parts of this critique. So I'll just read some of the important quotes from the text. He says, "Far from being a faithful description of behavior, the theory of conditioned reflexes is a construction inspired by the atomistic postulates of realistic analysis." So we've talked about atomism before. We talked in part 1 of this series on what realistic analysis means for Merleau-Ponty. And so what he had said was that this book is going to take the path of exploring behavior because he thinks that exploring that in that framework can be a more neutral kind of exploration, engaging first with the assertions of behaviorists, of those who take a more atomistic view of behavior. So that's kind of what he's doing in this part of the book. Okay, so this next quote, he says, "If the term conditioned reflex has any meaning, it should designate a relatively stable reaction linked with certain stimuli. The observation of animals reveals, however, that the reactions are variable and can be disassociated or even reversed. But with the notions of inhibition and reciprocal induction, Pavlov provided himself with the principles which allow him to stop up all the cracks in the theory, as well as to construct an explanation that leaves the notion of conditioned reflex intact. The mechanisms of excitation, inhibition, and disinhibition which he invokes necessarily appear as expedient devices designed to mask the disagreement between theory and experiment. So again, I'm not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty, but just want to highlight that he thinks of Pavlov's theory, how it's set up is that it is not, it doesn't have a true extensive integrity to it. He sees that there are ways that Pavlov, as he says, he like stops up the cracks, or he masks misalignment between theory and what experiment shows. He kind of says that Pavlov gives himself ways like to kind of cop out of the questions that it doesn't all account for. And in a later slide, I'll talk about that again. So he says, a theory which without experimental support posits forces in contrary directions, posits forces in contrary directions, it evidently escapes being contradicted by experience. It can always bring into play at the right moment one of the two principles. And so that's what he says that Pavlov's theory does. It gives itself like built-in different directions you can take it, so that no matter what an experiment brings up, it cannot be contradicted by experiment. He says, for the same reason, it is not susceptible to any experimental justification, if that's the case. So he says, far from being patterned on the facts, Pavlov's categories are imposed upon them. The terms excitation, inhibition, and disinhibition properly designate certain descriptive aspects of behavior, which are made known to us by our internal and external experiences. Because he carried descriptive notions found in the observation of behavior directly over into the central nervous system, Pavlov was able to believe that he employed a physiological method. In reality, it amounts to an imaginary physiology. So he's saying that Pavlov was not entirely just building a theory based on kind of necessary principles, but that he was imposing observations and descriptive aspects of behavior that we see in experience. And he says that's not a truly, that's not a theory that has the integrity that we would need from it. And he later says, I think in maybe the next slide, it's better if we're just honest with ourselves, that if we are being descriptive, if we are looking at behavior in our experience, let's be honest that that's what we're doing. He says Pavlov is not honest, forthcoming enough that that's what he does. He imposes something on on the facts. He's not just driven by just the facts themselves like he claims to be. Okay, and so he says, one can wonder, in all justice, whether in physiological knowledge, objectivity is not confused with the methods of physical and chemical measurement. And I think that's a really interesting quote right there. The application of physical and chemical excitants and the measurement of chronaxes allow us to note certain effects of nerve activity under determined conditions, which conditions, moreover, are rather different from those of its normal exercise. It is not certain that nerve functioning can be adequately categorized or characterized in this way. So just to pause there, he's saying the limitations that exist in a physical or chemical measurement are real. Some people just equate so strongly like pure objectivity with like scientific measurement. But the fact is that anytime there's an experiment or a measurement, you're looking within some contained conditions. You're observing in this kind of limited way. And those maybe artificial conditions, determined conditions, is not necessarily the normal exercise of the organism that you're observing. Kurt Goldstein made that same point in his work. Okay, so that's an important point. He continues, in the present state of our knowledge, in any case, whether we examine the organism by means of the observation of behavior, or by means of the measurement of reactions evoked in it by certain physical and chemical agents, only the manifestations of nerve functioning are grasped, and the two procedures are equally indirect. Inferences are equally necessary in both cases. So again, this critique that Pavlov is claiming to be driven just by facts and kind of objectivity, but in fact, there are inferences being made. Merleau-Ponty continues, since nobody can, in fact, start with physiology, Pavlov begins with a study of behavior, with a description of the reactions of the organism in the presence of certain situations, in spite of his own principles. So he says that's not what Pavlov claims to do. That's not what his principles, as stated, are. And Merleau-Ponty is just pointing out that that's because it's impossible to start with a pure kind of physiology as a starting point. So Merleau-Ponty uses this argument to say it's better, it's more solid to have an honest, deliberately descriptive, and psychological method to help us study behavior. That's what that last point says. Okay, so the next part of part 2, the next chapter in part 2 is titled The Central Sector of Behavior and the Problem of Localizations. So the preceding part was really focused on critiques of Pavlov, and now we're moving on to the chapter that's titled The Central Sector. Okay, so he says, to the theory of conditioned reflexes as to the classical theory of reflexes. I don't know how to say this, but his question must be posed. In nerve phenomena, are we dealing in reality with functions of the structure or with functional structures? And at the end of this video, we'll re-examine this question and we'll find out which of those two very slightly different wordings he wants to go with. And it's not immediately clear what the difference is, but that's an important quote there. So in the next slide, I'm going to go over that there are 3 points of agreement that Merleau-Ponty says he has concerning the meaning of localizations in general and concerning the significance of place in nerve substance. So place is going to be an important concept and question in this part of the book. These will allow us to be acquainted with the central sector of behavior and to understand its insertion in the body. Okay, I know there's a lot of words, but I wanted to fit all 3 of the points of agreement on one slide because they're underlined and they're relatively short. In the book, he says, like, this is number 1, and then he has the quote, and then he'll continue with an exploration of it, but he does very clearly outline what these 3 points of agreement are. So I've listed them here. And in between these 3 points, he spends pages really talking about them, and again, it's kind of a dry portion of the book. He goes into really specific things that I'm going to do my best to kind of give you the main gist of it. So this is really all I'm going to say about these 3 points of agreement, as he calls them. And then it's, again, just kind of a part of the book where you would need to go and read it for yourself. And there's some important quotes. I just chose not to fit all of the quotes that I could have into this slideshow today. Okay, so I'm just going to try to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what each of these 3 points means. So the first point of agreement. 1. A lesion, even localized, can determine structural disorders which concern the whole of behavior. and analogous structural disorders can be provoked by lesions situated in different regions of the cortex. So this point is calling out that there are often deficiencies of a fundamental function. Difficulties, he uses the kind of wording of like going beyond the sphere of immediate reality. That, for instance, in Goldstein's research of brain-injured soldiers, there's this kind of fundamental obstacle that you see in a lot of different people, whatever the particulars are of their cases. There's this kind of overarching difficulty of transcending their immediate reality to that of the possible. The term, the possible, comes from Goldstein. To be oriented to the possible is something that people with traumatic brain injuries can sometimes have difficulty with. So I believe that Merleau-Ponty is kind of referencing that here, that there can be localized lesions to the brain, but we can see that there are disorders which concern the whole of behavior, that there is a more overarching effect. It's not this atomistic kind of formula of a lesion just in this part of the brain is only concerned with the part, but that there's a whole to this. So that's what he says. In the last part, under part 1, it says, not just isolating elements, but understanding the character of a whole and its immanent law. Okay, agreement part 2. Nevertheless, nerve functioning cannot be treated as a global process where the intervention of any of the parts would be of equal importance. The function is never indifferent to the substrate by which it is achieved. So this is kind of a nuance, a counterpoint to number 1, kind of counterbalances it. The existence of parts, that there are still parts in the nervous system and brain. They have specialization, and later in this part of the book, he's going to talk about that parts might be seen like a figure, in a figure ground. So this is a big Gestalt concept. It's just the example of a person who is staring at, say, a dot surrounded by black on a page. The figure is the dot. The dot is what my eyes focus on, and the ground is kind of the background. So that's a big kind of key concept in Gestalt theory. Gestalt, it may be defined very succinctly as the idea of a figure that arises in one's perception. That is a very central kind of idea that Merleau-Ponty is using and thinking about, meditating on in this whole book. But yes, it's the idea that there is still that figure, and it does arise in a way that it is somewhat distinct from the ground, from the background. So it's this idea that it's both and, it's connected, it's part of a ground, but it's still distinct in some way. So that's what this point is saying, is we're talking about a structure where that does not mean we're talking about a whole thing is just purely simple. It's still structural, it's still complex, and there are parts that serve functions. So he wants to keep that in mind as well. Point number 3, consequently, place in nerve substance has an equivocal signification. Only a mixed conception of localizations and a functional conception of parallelism can be accepted. I don't think I can fully explain what point 3 means to really give you that full picture, but I did find a quote that does speak to that last part of it on functional conception of parallelism, which I put it here underneath point 3. He says, the discrediting of realistic analysis, which we talked about last time, in psychology as well as in physiology brings about the substitution of a functional or structural parallelism for parallelism of elements or contents. So instead of kind of looking at consciousness, consciousness and the life of the organism, which he's going to talk about here, we're not just kind of looking at like things and consciousness as like two different elements. He doesn't want to just look at contents, a sum of contents. In talking about the idea of parallelism, he says we need to substitute that instead with a functional or structural parallelism. He continues, mental facts and physiological facts are no longer brought together in pairs. It is recognized that the life of consciousness and the life of the organism are not made up of a collection of events external to each other, like the grains of sand in a pile, but rather that psychology and physiology are both investigating the modes of organization of behavior and the degrees of its integration, the one in order to describe them, the other in order to determine their bodily foundation. So I think that this is a really rich quote. I think it's a very important one. And I just kind of want to read it to you. I'm not able to fully explain it. I think it'll make a bit more sense when we get a bit farther into the book. He's building up his thesis in this part of the book, but he's not fully diving into what it fully means. I think even just in the next video, he's going to flesh this out a bit more. I will say that for me, I had heard of Kurt Goldstein being important to the formulation of an idea of parallelism in the field of psychology. And I think that Merleau-Ponty is taking that up as well. And it's not immediately clear what all the nuances are of their idea of parallelism. In my mind, I'm not fully clear on Goldstein's definition of parallelism myself. I'd like to go back and get some more clarity on that. And I feel the same way about Merleau-Ponty. I'm hoping that through our study of this book, this idea of parallelism is going to become a bit more clear as to what he means. But what we can really see in this quote is this idea of an integration of psychology and physiology. They cannot be separated. They cannot be seen as like absolute. And that's what this whole book is really about. Okay, so kind of moving on from those points of agreement, he's going to talk a little bit more about the central sector and this idea of a coordinating system. Excuse me. Okay. He says, we are referred back then to a higher coordinating system. There can be no question of anything but a functional conception. This is to say that local specificities are distributed to the associative circuits themselves at each moment, according to what is demanded by the equilibrium of the total constellation. The problem disappears as soon as the local specificity of associative circuits is assigned to them, in each case, by the structure of the whole. Coordination itself appears as a result, the effect of a phenomenon of structure or form. So these are some really important terms here that we see. I think that he's pointing out that, of course, we need some kind of coordinating system since there is a whole. It's not just a lump sum of parts. There is coordination. There is a greater whole that is determining the parts. The whole determines the parts, this concept of Gestalt theory. So there's this idea that, okay, what might coordinate a system is the equilibrium to reach equilibrium. But I think that what he's saying here is to go beyond that, coordination is the effect of a phenomenon of structure or form. So what Goldstein was saying, I think, is the same thing that he's saying here. It's not just this Gestalt idea of equilibrium. It's that the form of a thing, it really has these values that drive it. So it's not simply trying to reach equilibrium. Coordination is the effect of something else. Equilibrium can be a factor, but it's almost this idea that there's something more meaningful at work. There is some kind of form which assigns the specificity of the parts. Their role is assigned by the form, the meaning, the purpose of the thing. So he talks about the difference between a machine and like a more, a more complex kind of organism. So he says, we're talking about the idea of coordination. Are we just talking about the coordination of a machine? And I think this is a very interesting question, as we have even more developed technology today, and we can look at things like artificial intelligence and kind of how would we define a machine that can do a lot of things now. I'll read the quote, and then maybe you'll find that an interesting question that arises from this quote. He says, a machine is capable only of operations for which it has been constructed. The idea of a machine which would be capable of responding to an indefinite variety of stimuli is a contradictory one, since automation is obtained only by submitting the initiation of work to certain chosen conditions. Thus, we are led to a type of coordination very different from that which was defined above. So Merleau-Ponty is not just exploring the idea of machines, he's exploring organisms and people, all forms of kind of organic life, organic systems. So he contrasts that with the more limited kind of coordination that we see in a machine. So I just think it's an interesting question now, that I wonder what Merleau-Ponty would say when he sees the advanced kind of complexity that we have in, it's like AI is determined by, I'm not a professional in that, but, determined by how it's programmed, determined by the information that is fed into it. It's still limited. It's not unlimited. But I think it can be argued that people are also not unlimited in our kind of knowledge and our basis for making decisions. And I think that now we have more sophisticated machines that can do a lot more to respond to a high variety of stimuli, like he says. So I think it's an interesting quote. Just wanted to put that in there. But yes, he's talking about, we're not just talking about a simple kind of coordination. In this part, he uses the same analogy of a melody that Max Wertheimer used in his address on Gestalt theory to describe a gestalt, to describe a whole that is different than the sum of its parts. It's this idea that a melody can still have the same kind of structure. It can have, it can be played with different notes in it. It can be transposed. So in that same way, this is the kind of coordination or structure that Merleau-Ponty is talking about. He says, coordination is now the creation of a unity of meaning, which is expressed in the juxtaposed parts. So it can have different parts, but the same unity of meaning in the melody, for example. The creation of certain relations, which owe nothing to the materiality of the terms which they unite. This is very Gestalt right here. It's this idea of form. Merleau-Ponty uses different words that basically mean the same idea. Form, structure, coordination, a Gestalt, a whole. All of those words can kind of be interchanged for this idea. That's this fundamental kind of concept in this book, taken from Gestalt theory, that there is a structure that we see, which regardless of the parts it's composed of, it has a unity of meaning. Okay. And he touches on the physiology of language. He says the physiology of language has need of a coordination of this kind. And for those who are interested in his thoughts on language, I think this part of the book you might be interested in checking out. I'm not really going to go into that in my slideshow. Okay, he says, if one wants to establish the parallel between the dynamism of psychology and that of modern physiology, which H. Piron believes he must accept, it will be necessary to conceive of coordination, whether it be receptive or insight motor, as Gestalt theory does, that is, as the constitution of forms or of functional structures. So if you remember in one of our first slides, he asked these two different, very nuanced differences of, I forget what the other one was, but it was something or functional structures. So this is the one that he's going with, is functional structures. That's the phrasing that he thinks we should use. So it's this idea of forms. In response to this overarching question of consciousness and nature, his big thesis is seeing the structure of behavior, seeing forms that are based on our observations of behavior. That this is this kind of answer, this thesis that he's working towards. And he builds up to it in this part of the book, and he's going to talk more about forms and just fleshing this out a lot more in our next video. So this is kind of the rough building up and exploring and critiquing before he really gets into painting us a picture of what he means. So he says, it is necessary to conceive of coordination as forms or functional structures. Says, in summary, whether it be a question of the comprehension of a word, again, that's kind of with the language philosophy there, or of the perception of colors, or of spatial positions, the putting into action of pre-established apparatuses, which the stimuli, in virtue of their objective properties, would release from the outside, cannot be seen in nerve functioning. The physiological process which corresponds to the perceived color or position or to the signification of a word must be improvised, actively constituted at the very moment of perception. He says, thus, function has a positive and proper reality. It is not a simple consequence of the existence of organs or substrate. The process of excitation forms an indecomposable unity. And notice that we had that term before in our first video. It's an important term whenever you see that. And is not made up of the local processes. The color or the position which will be effectively perceived following such and such retinal excitations depends not only on the properties of the latter, but on the laws proper to nerve functioning. It is not the stimuli which constitute the reactions, nor which determine the contents of perception. It is not the real world which constitutes the perceived world. So that's a very important quote that is this answer to this question. The same question Kurt Goldstein was responding to is, when I see a figure in my perception, when there's a light on in my room and my vision is directed towards it, am I simply determined by that stimuli? Is that the cause? Or does also my inner field enter into the equation? Does my unique nervous system, my own nerve functioning also play a role in determining how I perceive this thing? So that's what this is really about. So he says, function has a reality. We're asking this question of what is real, what are things? And he says it's not just the existence of organs, it's not just retinal excitations acting on my eye. What else is real when we're thinking about a person perceiving something? So that's what this is really about. Okay, he says the living physiology of the nervous system can only be understood by starting from phenomenal givens. So these are just a few short quotes that I think are really important. So he says that there are some kind of phenomenal givens. In this book, he's asking, what did Pavlov say we have to start with? What can we start with as givens? So that's kind of what this is connecting back to. There are phenomenal givens. It's not simply like this ability to build a pure physiology and build up from those kind of stackable parts. There's something else that is given, something that is phenomenal. Okay. The second quote on this page reminds me of Kurt Lewin, who was an important figure in the development of Gestalt theory. And he said that the need determines the Gestalt, the figure. How I perceive is determined by my own needs. And that's what really this quote is making me think of. He says, I do not perceive simply things, but also use objects, an article of clothing, for example. And I won't go into it, but he kind of talks about how when we see like a shirt, we're already thinking about how would I put it on. When I look at it from the other direction, I can already easily know which arm goes on me. The way that I relate to this shirt that I'm looking at might be determined by how would I use it. And so I think that's a really great point that he just kind of briefly touches on. The last quote, he says, nerve functioning distributes not only spatial and chromatic values, but also symbolic values. Okay, he says, the notion of form has value precisely because it goes beyond the atomistic conception of nerve functioning, without reducing it to a diffuse and undifferentiated activity, because it rejects psychological empiricism without going to the intellectualist antithesis. The analysis of perception will lead to reestablishing a demarcation, no longer between sensation and perception, or between sensibility and intelligence, or more generally between a chaos of elements and a higher system which would organize them, but between different types or levels of organization. This is a very important quote. There's a lot there to unpack, but that's a very important quote for the thesis of this whole book. That there are levels of organization. There's not just parts, a chaos of elements, as he says. It's both and. This book is very much about the both and, the integration of these different things. It's not just the elements, and it's not just the higher system. It's levels of organization, it's structure. And he says form has value. This idea of form, as the Gestalt theorists give it to us, is the right way to describe this point. That's what he says. He says, concerning the relations of behavior in the brain, the preceding analyses can have two meanings. Perhaps they require only changing categories and introducing the notion of form in physiology. So he says, okay, we know that form is an important concept. Do we just use it as a form in physiology? Form, in the sense in which we have defined it, possesses original properties with regard to those of the parts which can be detached from it. So a whole that is different from its parts, a whole that is greater than its parts. It's not a mere lump sum of stacked parts. We can just use that in a more physiological way, he's saying. Each moment in it is determined by the grouping of the other moments, and their respective value depends on a state of total equilibrium, the formula of which is an intrinsic character of form. In this sense, it seems to fulfill all the conditions necessary for giving an account of nerve functioning. Thus, it would be possible to define it as a process of the figure and ground type. So he talks a little bit more about figure and ground here. He says, these uncontested, sorry about the typos there, uncontested localizations represent points of the cortex where the essential processes unfold, the figure, without our ever being able to separate them completely from a ground. So there are parts, there are localizations that do exist, but they are necessarily connected to the total process, which is constituted by the activity of the rest of the cortex. Thus, on the condition that form is introduced in nerve functioning, a parallelism or a rigorous isomorphism could be maintained. But this is the catch. This is the shift here. He says, but the very fact that we had to borrow the terms figure and ground from the phenomenal or perceived world in order to describe these physiological forms, just as above with the metaphor of the melody we talked about, leads us to wonder if these are still physiological phenomena. So he says, I don't know that this way of describing of a form can be used in a purely physiological way, like I had kind of been asking. It would seem maybe, yeah, we can just talk about form, some of its parts in a very kind of materialist way. But he says, when we talk about a figure and ground, this is a kind of terminology that comes from the perceived world, the experience of perception. Can we really separate psychology from physiology? Can we separate perception from a thing, from an object, thingness? Can that be separated from mind, from consciousness? He says, I don't think it can. And I really love how he makes that point, that this idea of figure and ground, of the reality of a part that is still part of a whole, but it is still a part, it's distinct, it's not this blob. It's very true, it does a really good job of describing reality, but it is still so tied to someone perceiving it, that it is not truly just purely objective. And that's a really foundational kind of part of his thesis of this whole book, is we cannot remove perception from how we understand reality. He continues with this point. He says, the function dot, that figure of a dot with a black background, dot on a homogeneous ground, or more generally, the function figure and ground has a meaning only in the perceived world. It is there that we learn what it is to be a figure and what it is to be a ground. The perceived world would be explicable only by the perceived itself, and not by physiological processes. A physiological analysis of perception would be purely and simply impossible. So this is kind of a response to what I think he said Pavlov was trying to do, is this kind of pure physiology. And he says that we can't do that, and it's better to be honest about the fact that we can't do that, rather than to impose what we perceive, observations of behavior, into a description of physiology. Like, if that's entering into the equation, then let's be honest about it instead of pretending that it's not. He says, as one moves, and these are the very last pages of this part of the book before he goes into the next chapter within part 2. These are the very last pages, this slide and the next. And it's so important, so much of the real meat of this part of the book is in these pages, that I have some really long quotes where I just really type out what he says here at the end of this chapter. He says, as one moves toward the center of the cortex, the conditions of behavior, instead of being found in the nerve substance as such, as may happen on the periphery, are more and more to be found in the qualitatively variable modes of its global functioning. So whenever you see that word qualitative, notice that it's this idea of like a stack of quantity versus qualitatively different or qualitatively variable. Okay, He says, a logical hierarchy of functional levels is substituted for the spatial juxtaposition of the peripheral conductors, and in case of lesion, disorder of structure are substituted for deficiencies of contents. Since the structure of behavior, so notice that's the title of the book, and the cerebral functioning which supports it can only be conceived in terms borrowed from the perceived world, this latter no longer appears as an order of phenomena parallel to the order of physiological phenomena, but as one which is richer than it is. Physiology cannot be completely conceptualized without borrowing from psychology. All right, so this is our last slide, the very last words of this chapter. He says, and in the final analysis, what does the failure of a physiology of space perception signify? It signifies that a model of space as perception reveals it cannot be constructed either in real space or in real mental facts by an assemblage of parts. Or it signifies, as Kant had said, that real extension, parts, extra parts, presupposes known extension. Thus it is to the ideality of space, to which these simple remarks would lead. It will be possible to establish the conclusions only after a stricter analysis of the notion of form. So this is kind of a transition quote leading into our next video. It's not a truly conclusive quote. We're going to see a little bit more about what he means by some of this in our next video. So just had to do 2 videos on part 2 because it's a longer part of the book, and I want to really do justice to this part and then to the thesis, which he's going to flesh out much more in the next part, talking about forms. And I think he's going to talk more about this kind of other side of things, of the ideality of space, which he talks about, and the merits that come from Kant. So I'm looking forward to picking back up next time with the rest of part 2 of the structure of behavior. Thanks.